NATO's official position on the Pershing II was plain and stated repeatedly on the record for years. The missile had a range of 1,800 kilometers. It was based in West Germany specifically to counter a new Soviet weapon, and given that range from those bases, it could not physically reach Moscow. Soviet leadership did not believe a word of it. Warsaw Pact intelligence assessments credited the same missile with a range closer to 2,500 kilometers, a difference that, from bases in West Germany, was the entire distance between a regional deterrent and a weapon capable of reaching the Soviet capital's own command bunkers in as little as 6 to 8 minutes of flight time. Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov, who had spent 15 years running the KGB before taking the Kremlin's top job, personally distrusted American assurances that the missile's targeting had ever been anything else, and treated the Western range figures as disinformation, covering for exactly the capability his own military feared most. Two governments, one missile, and a disagreement that was never resolved through diplomacy, never resolved by either side's own declassified assessments, and never resolved before the missile itself was destroyed under a treaty 5 years after it first became operational. NATO's engineers signed off on one description of what this missile could do. The Kremlin's own leadership built its entire response around a different one. Neither side ever got to be simply right, and neither side ever admitted the other might be. The missile at the center of that disagreement began, like so much of this channel's material, as an answer to a European worry Washington had not originally raised on its own. On October 28, 1977, West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt addressed the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London and warned publicly about what he called a eurostrategic imbalance. His specific fear was decoupling, the danger that once the United States and the Soviet Union reached rough parity in intercontinental weapons, an American president might hesitate to risk a full strategic exchange over an attack confined to Europe, leaving the continent's own security only as strong as whatever nuclear forces were actually stationed on European soil. A missile like the Soviet SS-20, capable of hitting any target in Western Europe while never being able to reach the continental United States, exploited exactly that gap. Schmidt's speech, not a Pentagon planning document, is the moment usually credited with pushing the alliance toward the response that followed. Under its own internal designation, RSD-10 Pioneer, and known to NATO by the reporting name SS-20, Sabre, the missile that changed everything entered Soviet service in 1976. A road-mobile intermediate-range weapon, 16.5 meters long, 1.79 meters in diameter, weighing about 37,000 kilograms at launch, carried to dispersed firing positions on a 6-axle MAZ-547 transporter so it could be moved and hidden rather than found and struck first. Its range of 5,000 kilometers put every capital in Western Europe inside reach from launch sites deep in Soviet territory, and its most widely fielded variant carried 3 separate 150-kiloton warheads on independently targetable re-entry vehicles, a single missile capable of striking 3 different cities at once. By late 1985, the Soviet Union had built out 48 SS-20 bases, holding a peak force of 441 launchers, carrying roughly 1,323 warheads between them. Against that, NATO's planned response, the 108 Pershing II launchers eventually deployed, carried a single warhead each, 108 total. NATO planners had a weapon they considered nearly impossible to locate before it fired and impossible to ignore once it had. And they were building their answer to it at something like 1/12 the warhead count. The American response predates the SS-20 becoming public justification by a full year, and it was built to replace a missile with a far more limited reach. The Pershing I-A, approved for development in 1965 and in service by 1969, had a range of only about 740 kilometers, enough to strike targets across the Warsaw Pact's own satellite states in Eastern Europe, but nowhere close to Soviet territory itself. In March 1975, the U.S. Army awarded a contract to Martin Marietta, the same contractor that built the Sprint interceptor for the Safeguard program, to develop a genuine successor. The resulting Pershing II was originally intended to carry an Earth-penetrating warhead designated the W-86, built specifically to dig into the ground before detonating against hardened underground command bunkers. That design was never actually fielded. The version that went into service instead carried a more conventional variable yield W-85 warhead, adjustable between 5 and 80 kilotons, without the Earth-penetrating feature. Its extended range still reclassified it from a short-range weapon into a medium-range one, the first version of this missile family able to reach into Soviet territory proper rather than stopping at the borders of Moscow's own satellite states. The first Pershing II test firing took place on November 18, 1977, at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Once the deployment of the SS-20 made the strategic gap impossible to ignore, NATO's foreign and defense ministers met in Brussels on December 12, 1979, and adopted what became known as the double-track decision. Track 1 committed the alliance to seek negotiated reciprocal limits on intermediate range forces with Moscow. Track 2 committed NATO, if those talks failed by the fall of 1983, to deploy 108 Pershing II launchers to replace the older Pershing I-A, and to add 464 BGM-109G ground, launched cruise missiles across several Allied countries. The decision to build a diplomatic off-ramp and a deployment deadline into the same document at the same meeting is the origin point for almost everything that followed, including the argument about what the missile could actually do that neither side ever settled. What the Pershing II could actually do, mechanically, is where the range dispute actually starts to make sense, because this was not an ordinary ballistic missile by the standards of its era. It was a solid-fueled, two-stage design built by Martin Marietta, 10.61 meters long, 1.02 meters in diameter, with a launch weight of about 7,400 kilograms. Its guidance system combined a Singer-Kierfahrt inertial navigation platform with a Goodyear Aerospace active radar system that compared the terrain the warhead was actually flying over against radar maps stored in its own onboard memory, correcting its course in the final seconds of flight. That combination gave the Pershing II a circular error probable of about 30 meters, an extraordinary figure for a ballistic missile of the period, tight enough to threaten a specific hardened bunker or command post, rather than simply a city grid square. NATO's declared range for this weapon was 1,800 kilometers. Warsaw Pact intelligence assessments put the real figure closer to 2,500 kilometers. And Soviet threat assessments had been shaped from the start by the missile's original Earth-penetrating warhead concept, the W-86, even after that specific design was dropped in favor of the more conventional W-85 actually deployed. The 6 to 8 minute figure itself is simple ballistic geometry, not propaganda, at least as a general property of the missile class. An intercontinental missile flying between continents spends most of its flight time coasting through space on a long arc before re-entry, which is why intercontinental ballistic missiles typically take 25 to 30 minutes pole to pole. A medium-range missile fired from a base a few hundred kilometers from its target skips almost all of that coasting phase, climbing, arcing, and re-entering in a small fraction of the time, and a missile capable of the Warsaw Pact's attributed 2,500-kilometer reach, fired from southwestern Germany toward Moscow, would spend most of its short flight still accelerating rather than gliding. Consider that for a moment. A missile accurate enough to hit a single bunker, credited by one side with the range to reach the capital of the other, and shadowed from its own design history by a warhead built to dig into the ground before detonating, even after that exact warhead was never actually built into the fielded missile. Whether or not the 2,500-kilometer figure was accurate, it is easy to understand, looking at those numbers together, why Moscow treated the disagreement as existential rather than academic. That disagreement shaped the actual diplomacy far more than the popular memory of this period usually credits, and getting the doctrine right here means correcting exactly that misreading. On November 18, 1981, President Reagan proposed what became known as the zero option. The United States would cancel its planned deployment of Pershing II missiles and cruise missiles entirely if the Soviet Union eliminated all of its SS-20 missiles, along with the older SS-4 and SS-5 missiles already targeting Western Europe. Reaction at the time was mixed, dismissed by some as unrealistic, and by others as a propaganda gesture never meant to be accepted. The following summer, on July 16, 1982, the two chief negotiators in Geneva, the American Paul Nitze and the Soviet Yuli Kvitsinski, went for a walk in the woods outside the city and privately worked out a compromise that would have limited deployed intermediate missiles on both sides well short of full deployment, obviating the need for the planned Pershing II rollout entirely in exchange for sharp cuts to the SS-20 force. Both governments rejected the deal. Nitze had exceeded his negotiating authority simply by proposing it, and the walk in the woods produced nothing beyond the story of two men briefly agreeing to something neither capital would ratify. With Track 1 exhausted, Track 2 proceeded exactly as scheduled, though not without one last fight in the West German parliament itself. On November 22, 1983, after a debate that had run some 26 hours, the Bundestag voted 286 to 226, with one abstention, to confirm the deployment, a margin of 60 votes in a chamber that had split almost entirely along the same lines dividing Chancellor Helmut Kohl's Christian Democrats from Schmidt's old Social Democratic opposition. As the result was read out, anti-nuclear demonstrators camped outside the Parliament building set off an AIR raid siren that echoed through the streets of Bonn. Hours later, the first Pershing II launchers began arriving in the country the Bundestag had just voted to accept them into. The first Pershing II launchers arrived in West Germany in November 1983. Initial operational status was reached on December 15, 1983, at the Muttlangen site under a battery, 1st Battalion, 41st Field Artillery, and full deployment of all 108 launchers was complete by late 1985, spread across 3 West German sites approved by the Bundestag. 36 missiles each at Muttlangen, near Schwäbisch Gmünd, at the Waldheide, near Heilbronn, and at Neu-Ulm. The Pershing II itself went only to West Germany. The 464 ground-launched cruise missiles from the same double-track decision were spread instead across 6 bases in 5 countries: the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, West Germany, and the Netherlands, though the planned Dutch site at Woensdrecht was ultimately never activated at all. Read that sentence twice. A missile whose own range was formally disputed by the government it was aimed at went from a negotiating chip to fully operational hardware, while both sides were still arguing, on the record, about a basic fact concerning what it could physically do. The man most convinced that the missile was a decapitation weapon did not live to see the argument settled either way. Yuri Andropov died of kidney failure on February 9, 1984, just 16 months into his tenure as General Secretary, and less than 3 months after the first Pershing IIs reached West Germany. He was succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko, 72 years old, and himself in failing health, who led the Soviet Union for only 13 more months before dying in March 1985. Andropov had reportedly wanted a younger reform-minded protege, Mikhail Gorbachev, to succeed him directly, and by most accounts other party leaders blocked that succession specifically to keep Gorbachev out of the top job while they still could. Only after Chernenko's own death in 1985 did Gorbachev finally take power. And it was Gorbachev, not the man who had spent years treating the missile as an existential threat, who ultimately negotiated it away. Deployment did not end the negotiation, and the path back to an actual treaty ran through a summit that came close to eliminating nuclear weapons entirely before it collapsed over something unrelated to Pershing II specifically. On October 11th and 12th, 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland, and in the course of 2 days of exchanges came within reach of an agreement to eliminate both countries' entire nuclear arsenals by the year 2000, with real, substantial progress made specifically on intermediate-range missiles along the way, progress that later negotiators would carry directly into the INF Treaty itself. The whole summit broke down instead over Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, the same missile defense program his administration had announced 3 years earlier. Gorbachev wanted SDY research confined to the laboratory. Reagan would not accept any limit on it at all, and the 2 men left Reykjavik without an agreement of any kind. What survived the collapse was the intermediate-range progress itself, which negotiators picked back up over the following year and carried to a signature a little over a year later. The Chancellor, whose own warning had started the whole sequence, did not survive to see it through. Helmut Schmidt's coalition collapsed in September 1982, when his Free Democratic Party partners resigned over unrelated budget disagreements, and on October 1, 1982, the Bundestag removed him in a formal vote of no confidence, the first time in the Federal Republic's history a chancellor had been ousted that way. The missile debate was not the official reason for the collapse, but it was very much the pressure underneath it. Leading figures in Schmidt's own Social Democratic Party had turned against the deployment he had personally set in motion 5 years earlier, some calling for unilateral disarmament outright. And his own foreign minister later suggested Schmidt had partly welcomed the unrelated budget fight as a way to leave office before his party's revolt over the missiles forced the issue directly. The chancellor who told NATO Europe needed this missile did not last long enough to see it actually stationed for even a full year under his own government. What almost nobody in the enormous public movement against this missile ever debated was that specific dispute. And that is the piece of this story most retellings skip entirely. The scale of the opposition was real, and remains, to this day, one of the largest peace mobilizations post-war Europe ever produced. On October 22, 1983, roughly 700,000 people massed across Bonn, Hamburg, Stuttgart, and West Berlin in a single coordinated day of protest, while in London, the same weekend, the campaign for nuclear disarmament drew about 400,000 people into Hyde Park, the largest demonstration in the organization's history. 2 years earlier, in September 1981, a group calling itself Women for Life on Earth had established a peace camp outside the Royal Air Force Base at Greenham Common specifically to oppose the planned basing of cruise missiles there. And by a single action in December 1982, some 35,000 women had joined the camp's demonstrations, and the camp itself remained continuously occupied for 12 years afterward, not closing until 1993, 6 years after the treaty that would eventually remove the missiles the camp had been founded to protest. Almost none of that genuinely massive movement, and almost none of the wider public watching it unfold on television, was arguing about whether the missile's declared range was 1,800 kilometers or 2,500, or whether its guidance system's Earth-penetrating capability made it something closer to a decapitation weapon than a regional deterrent. That argument was happening inside Soviet intelligence assessments and inside Andropov's own suspicion of Western assurances, not on the streets of Bonn or in Hyde Park. The treaty that eventually removed the missile grew out of the superpower negotiation Reagan's zero option had first floated in 1981, and Mikhail Gorbachev eventually accepted after coming to power. Not as a direct concession wrung out by the protests, even though the protests are the part of this story almost everyone remembers correctly, and the range dispute is the part almost nobody remembers at all. The actual work of turning the Reykjavik Progress into treaty language fell to Maynard Glittman, a career Foreign Service arms control specialist Reagan sent back to head the American delegation in Geneva, starting in 1985. Glittman led the INF talks through their final 2 years, negotiating the specific verification language and elimination timelines the earlier political-level exchanges had never worked out. And it was his delegation's work that Reagan and Gorbachev actually had in front of them by the time they were ready to sign. That negotiation finally produced the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev in Washington on December 8, 1987, the first arms control agreement between the two superpowers to require the outright destruction of already deployed weapons rather than simply capping future production. The treaty eliminated every American and Soviet missile with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, Pershing IIs and the older Pershing 1A and 1B alongside them, and every SS-20, SS-4, and SS-5 on the Soviet side, backed by an on-site inspection and data exchange regime that was itself a historic first in arms control verification. The United States Senate ratified the treaty by a vote of 93-5 on May 27, 1988, a margin that stood in sharp contrast to the 60-vote squeaker that had approved deployment in the Bundestag 5 years earlier. The same missile going from the closest kind of political fight to something close to consensus once a treaty existed to remove it rather than a decision to station it. Notice what that 500 to 5,500 kilometer bracket did to the argument this whole story started with. Whether the Pershing II's true range was NATO's declared 1,800 kilometers or the Warsaw Pact's attributed 2,500, both figures sat comfortably inside the band the treaty banned outright. The negotiators never had to resolve which government had been telling the truth about the missile's real capability. They simply wrote a range bracket wide enough that the dispute stopped mattering to the treaty's own text, even though it never stopped mattering to the people who had spent years arguing about it. By the implementation deadline of June 1, 1991, the two governments had jointly destroyed 2,692 short, medium, and intermediate-range missiles between them. The treaty's own text allowed each side to preserve up to 15 inert examples for museum display, missiles rendered permanently unusable by filling critical internal components with concrete, though in practice only a small number were actually kept. Even the treaty that erased the missile did not last as long as the missile's own operational life had. Beginning in 2014, the United States accused Russia of testing, fielding, and eventually deploying a new ground-launched cruise missile, the 9M729, in violation of the same range limits the INF Treaty had set in 1987. Washington issued formal notice of withdrawal on February 2, 2019, and the treaty's own 6-month withdrawal clause meant American participation ended on August 2, 2019, 32 years after Reagan and Gorbachev had signed it in Washington. Russia denied the accusation, accused the United States of its own violations in turn, and gave notice that it would withdraw as well. The specific category of weapon this entire story is about: a ground-based missile with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers is no longer banned by any treaty between the two countries that once destroyed 2,692 of them to prove they meant it, and the United States has already started building the category back. In April 2024, the U.S. Army deployed a ground-based intermediate-range missile launcher called Typhoon, capable of firing Tomahawk cruise missiles and SM-6 missiles to the Philippines for a joint military exercise, the first time American ground-launched intermediate-range missiles had left a U.S. installation since the withdrawal 5 years earlier. In July 2024, NATO, the United States, and Germany jointly announced that episodic deployments of the same category of long-range strike system would begin reaching German soil as well, the identical country that spent the 1980s hosting the missile this script is actually about. A later Typhoon deployment to Germany was cancelled and the arrangement renegotiated. But by 2026, Germany was moving to purchase Typhoon launchers and Tomahawk missiles of its own, rather than simply hosting an American battery, the same country, deciding on its own initiative this time, to field the same category of weapon. Helmut Schmidt's government once nearly fell over hosting on America's behalf. Nobody has yet held a demonstration in Bonn or Berlin on the scale of October 1983 over the Typhoon system, and no Bundestag has yet had to hold a 26-hour debate before voting on it. But the underlying category of weapon this entire story concerns, a ground-launched missile with exactly the range that once split a chancellor's own party and put 1 million people in the streets of 2 countries, is once again a live procurement question rather than a piece of settled history. One of those examples still stands today. A Pershing II, disarmed under the treaty's own terms, occupies a place in the Boeing milestones of Flight Hall at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, positioned near a Soviet SS-20, the exact missile it was built to counter and never actually fired a shot against. The SS-20 standing beside it is not a decommissioned combat round pulled from an actual launch site. The Soviet Ministry of Defense had the Votkinsk machine-building plant, the same factory that built the operational missiles, construct this specific example for the purpose of sending it to a museum in Washington. a government that spent years insisting through Andropov and his successors that the West could not be trusted on basic facts about this weapons class, personally arranging for one of its own missiles to be built, shipped, and displayed in an American exhibition hall once the argument was finally over. The museum also holds a separate fragment of an SS-20, transferred by the government's own on-site inspection agency, a physical remnant of the verification regime that had never existed before this treaty required it. Neither missile in that hall can fly. Neither government ever agreed, in the years both weapons were operational, on the simple question of how far one of them could actually go, a dispute measured in a flight time of 6 to 8 minutes toward a capital that, on paper at least, it was never supposed to be able to reach.